Hey everybody, so in my most recent review of this In'Carius Craft XIIa Great Sword of War, I talked about the 12A typology and the characteristics of those swords. And it turns out I made a few mistakes and I wanted to get this video out to correct those. First off, I want to thank Mr. Angus Trim for taking the time to watch my review and then contact me privately and explain some of my mistakes and further my knowledge. One of the reasons I'm into swords is to learn more about them. And Mr. Trim has a wealth of knowledge about swords. So the fact that he just offers this completely free of charge, of his own volition, kudos to you, Mr. Trim, if you're watching this. So one of the things I said about 12A swords is that they were always lenticular in cross-section past the fuller. That's wrong. Flat out wrong. There are actually a good number that are hexagonal in cross-section. I have here records of the medieval sword. If we go to entry 12A.1, the very first one. This one is hexagonal in cross-section. So is number 12A.3. 12A.4, Mr. Trim told me, is probably hexagonal in cross-section, but it's kind of a blended hexagonal that actually ends up looking a lot like lenticular when in profile. Now, I also compared that sword to my Valor Arms 12A sword, and this one has that defined central ridge. So I asked Mr. Trim if he was familiar with any historical 12A swords that had that feature, that defined central ridge, and he said there wasn't any that he was aware of. So I think I can at least be partially correct in my comparison that the Valor Arms does not have the correct cross-section, but the In'Carius Craft with its lenticular cross-section, while that is absolutely good for a 12A, it's not the only cross-section that a 12A would have. So the other mistake that I made when discussing the Type 12A typology is in the tip. I had stated that the rounded acute point that you see here on the In'Carius Craft Warsword was typical for a 12A. That's not particularly accurate. This type of much more acute tip is also perfectly accurate for a 12A sword. In fact, most of the examples in records of the medieval sword are the more acute types. Frankly, for some reason, my personal idea of a 12A does include that more rounded acute tip, like on the In'Carius Craft, but the 12A typology does not require that rounded acute point. A much more acute point, like on the Valor Arms sword, is perfectly acceptable for that type. So one of the things I should know better by now is that you never use the words always and never when discussing historical swords. Swords from history have a ton of variants to them. They did not have typologies back then. This was something that was invented by oakeshott in the late 20th century. And here I am making a correction to this correction video. Oakeshott did not invent the typology of swords. He merely invented the one that we are most familiar with that we use for medieval swords, the oakeshott typology. But he based his work off of another typology, I believe was the Wheeler typology of Viking swords. Historically, medieval people just wouldn't have cared about that. They didn't go to their local cutler and say, I want a type 12A sword. No, they said, I want a sword. Maybe they would say one or two-handed. Maybe they would say they wanted to be a powerful cutter or something like that. They would never go into a cutler and say, I want a type 13B sword with a type J pommel and a type 3 crossguard. That didn't exist for them, and they didn't care about that. So the main takeaway from all this is that I want to continue learning about swords. Whether that's from books, whether it's from handling them, whether it's from listening to people who have more knowledge about them, especially when those people happen to have handled historical swords. So if they tell me I've made a mistake, I'm going to listen to them, and then I will correct myself if need be. So once again, I want to thank Mr. Trim for watching my video and providing his knowledge. And if any of you happen to notice me make a mistake when discussing typology, or really anything, please let me know, whether it's via the comments, Facebook, email, however you want to get a hold of me, it's fine. I hope this was as educational for you as it has been for me. Until next time, Alien Toot out.